Noah Kluge from PrecisionPoint Software. Today we'll review Power BI and different things to consider if you're considering to use Power BI. And then also we'll take an example of, or we'll take a look at a few real-life cases with it as well. So the agenda and specifics for today are to go over a few different components of it. So first is Power Pivot, and then there's PowerView and Power Query. So what are those, and what are the different things you need to be concerned with? Another topic for today will be implications for licensing within Microsoft. Things to watch out for also with versions of Power Pivot in particular. And then we'll take a look at using Power Pivot with the AX data source, and then we'll also look at using Power Pivot and PowerView with a data warehouse source, so kind of a compare and contrast in between those. And then finally, what I'll do is we'll open up the mic, and then if there are any questions, we'll answer those at the end. So we will we'll answer all questions at the end, and if you do want to go ahead and submit those, though, you are welcome to do that through the questions or through chat as well. Okay. So to get started here, we'll just do a little bit of a summary of the different components. The first I'll start with is Power Query, which is at the beginning of kind of the chain, if you will, from source to result. And Power Query is used primarily for unstructured data. It is available for users that have Excel 2010 or 2013 and also Office 365, provided that you have the Professional Plus version. So it's an Excel add-in, and then if you are on the lower level versions of Excel, those aren't going to be available to you. So Power Pivot is a version of Microsoft's, or it's an in-memory technology that Microsoft provides. It's part of Excel, or at least that's how most people think of it, and it lets you work with what I describe as more structured data, do calculations and things of that nature. When it comes to Excel licensing, it's the same story as Power Query. You do need to be on Professional Plus and above. And then for SQL Server, if you're going to run this in like a SharePoint environment, you need to have SQL 2008 R2 or forward to use Power Pivot. And then for SharePoint, it is available with the enterprise versions of SharePoint for 2010 and 2013. And then the newest version, or the newest edition, is PowerView, which is all about visualization of that data. And that became available with Excel 2013, so it's not available for 2010, but the storage is the same on the Professional Plus, so you have to be on that. And then when it comes to SQL Server with SharePoint, you need to be on SQL 2012 Service Pack 1. One thing to note when it comes to this, particularly with respect to PowerView, is that if you have users that are using tablets, in order to use PowerView, those tablets need to be running the Windows 8 version of the operating system. If they're running the quote light version of the operating system, which is Windows RT, then it won't work in those environments. So to go through these in a little bit, actually, before I get to that, a word about versions. This is it's kind of in the realm of a nuance, but it's a very important thing for you to understand if you are considering rolling out Power Pivot across a user base. And so what this comes down to is that Power Pivot started off its life as really a component of the SQL Server platform, and in particular with SQL 2008 R2. But now it's moved into the Office 2013 suite. So it's no longer considered a SQL Server component. It's now considered an Office 2013 component. Where this starts to get important is when you're looking at using Excel within 2010, because there are two different Excel add-ins that are available with Excel 2010. The first is the SQL Server 2008 version of the Power Pivot add-in, and then the second is the SQL Server 2012 version of Power Pivot. And this is important because the data models that are used for these are different. And what that means is that a version of Excel 2010 with the 2012 version of Power Pivot will open the older version, but the same is not true for if you have the SQL Server 2008 version of PowerPivot. So what that means is that if you have somebody with Excel 2010 and they have the SQL Server 2008 version of PowerPivot and they try to open up a newer data model, it won't work. So you need to be consistent within the organization, and if you have the flexibility, I do recommend that you probably just use the 2012 version because there's some fixes that were put in place there that can come in handy. Okay. So to get started on discussing these different components, Power Query is a good way to bring together what I'd refer to as kind of unstructured data. So this is data that might exist out in publicly available sources in the internet. So maybe stock information or Facebook statistical information, things like that. And what Power Query allows you to do is take different data sources and then conform them into the same structure. So you have the same number of columns, but then you can take data from different sources and then append them together into a single source that ultimately feeds into PowerPivot itself. An example of that might be that you have stock information that's off of the NYSE in the U.S. and then maybe NASDAQ information. And so those are two different sources. You can use Power Query to convert that into a single file that then would load into PowerPivot or to PowerView. So those are examples of where you would use Power Query. One thing, if you haven't poked around with it yet, I'd certainly say it is not an ETL or extract transform load tool. So even though you have the word query in it, don't see that and anticipate it's going to be an alternative to using Microsoft integration services or something like that. That's not its intended function. The other thing that I would say is that I think when it comes to structured SQL query, so again, against like relational databases, maybe your Dynamics system or another SQL Server database that you have, Power Query really doesn't offer any additional benefit. You should really just use PowerPivot directly. Okay, so we'll spend a little bit more time in PowerPivot, and to talk about kind of a little bit about what it is an in-memory cube technology, which means that the data ultimately is stored within memory or within the RAM of the computer that's running that version of Excel. It allows for you to create monster cubes and monster reports within the Excel environment, which can be a very powerful thing for analysts within an organization. And for those of you that have used Excel pivot tables over the course of probably 10 years or so, you may remember with Excel 2003, you used to have the ability to do cubes, local cubes within Excel. And this really is kind of that same type of flavor, but it's much more effective. The file sizes aren't massive. If you had used that version, you know what I'm talking about. But it's a much more usable format of that. So again, it's monster cubes and reports within Excel. PowerPivot also will allow for you to connect or collect data from different sources and bring them together within a single data model. And as far as kind of who it's intended to be used by, I would say that this is something that is more usable for power users or maybe for proof of concept within an IT organization. It's definitely a technical tool, but so for the information workers within the company, it's something that they would be able to use, but it's not. Don't expect that the AP person is going to go out and construct PowerPivot from scratch and so on. So that's not the intended audience for it. Another thing to note is that PowerPivot has its own calculation language. So it's called Data Analysis Expressions. It's shortened to DAX, not to be confused with Dynamics AX or DAX for those of you that run Dynamics AX. So this is, again, it's a language unique to PowerPivot. And the other thing to note is that PowerPivot does integrate with SharePoint Enterprise and Excel services. So if you have deployed or are considering deploying SharePoint Enterprise, this is something that you can consider to build out dashboards as an alternative possibly to using Performance Point services or something else. Okay, so what are some benefits and drawbacks to using PowerPivot? Well, first, a benefit is that it is quick and easy for an information worker to put together a quick ad hoc analysis. It is a familiar interface because it's really ultimately it's pivot tables, from that perspective. And for those of you that are on the proper licensing, it's really free, so that's always a benefit. And so really it's good for just quick ad hoc analysis. Our customers like to use PowerPivot because it lets them look at transactional information that's in the data warehouse rather than just going through a cube. So it's handy for that kind of analysis. A drawback to using PowerPivot is that you do have to understand the underlying data models. So it doesn't protect you from understanding data relationships. So you have to understand how the different tables fit together. For those of you that are running Dynamics AX, if you have virtual companies, it doesn't work particularly well with that because it doesn't handle joins very well. And I would say the same thing applies to multiple companies because you have, in AX, you have different data area IDs within a table, so that is a challenge for PowerPivot. And then for those of you that are running Dynamics NAV or NAV, the same thing applies there as well, where if you have multi-companies within the vision, you're going to have to take data from multiple tables to make sense out of it if you want a consolidated view. So that's just something to consider if you're going straight against the transaction systems. Of course, the alternative to doing that is to use a data warehouse or a set of views, and we'll talk about that in more detail as well. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to get pretty heavy into PowerPivot is that you'll inevitably need to learn a new language that's distinct from SQL, which is how you get data out of database tables, and it's also distinct from what's called MDX, which is how you get data from cubes. So it's a new language. Again, that language is called DAX, and so there's a little bit of learning that can come into play there. And then with the older version, so the original version of PowerPivot for SQL 2008, it doesn't do a particularly good job of handling hierarchies. So if you have like a time hierarchy and then you've got January through December, well, you don't want April to be first because it's in alphabetical order. You want it to be in chronological order. And that's an example of something that was resolved with SQL 2012 with that version of PowerPivot. So those are, again, some of the benefits and drawbacks to PowerPivot. So kind of to extend on some of those ideas, one thing I would say is that I don't believe it's a replacement for a data warehouse because it doesn't have that ETL or extract transform load capability of a tool like SSIS. So by extension, it's also not a replacement for SSIS. To go through an example for like a Dynamics AX system, if you have the custom invoice trans, which is where you've got all your sales invoice level detail, and you need to know the invoice account name, you have to go through several different tables in order to connect that stuff together. And PowerPivot itself is just not really intended to do those types of complex joins. And so in that context, there's limited ability to apply business rules within the load. And so then that's where a data warehouse type of implementation or infrastructure comes into play. And there is a security implication to all of this, because if you take if you use PowerPivot within Excel and you, to go through an example, maybe it's on top of your GL, what that means is that everything that's in your GL, or even more sensitive, if you have the customer information and you've got credit card or social security number information, all that information is going to exist within that PowerPivot-based report, because that data is going to get sucked into PowerPivot, and anybody who can open that can see any of that data. It's not going to apply permissions based upon who they are or anything like that. So that's just something to be aware of and to consider. Okay, so PowerView is a new visualization tool that's part of this suite of different products that Microsoft's providing. As I mentioned, it came out with Excel 2013, and it will work with SharePoint Enterprise, and the specific versions were 2010 and 2013, but you do need to include a particular add-in which has an extremely short name, but it's SQL Server 2012 Service Pack 1 Reporting Services Add-in. If you have that in your SharePoint environment, then you can use PowerView within SharePoint. Okay, so that's just a quick run through of these different technologies and kind of to give you a summary, maybe a little bit of an idea of things to consider or to watch out for here. Okay, and let me go ahead and go into a demo environment. Okay, so where I'm going to start is I'm going to start with using Power Pivot using a Dynamics source, and for because it's what's available to me, I'll start with the Dynamics, or I'll use a Dynamics AX source. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to that source, and how I got here was first you do need to go out to Microsoft's site and download the Excel Power Pivot add-in if you don't have it. And then again, that's where you need to make that decision on which version to use. So that's something that you need to consider before you do the installation itself. So I'm going to choose the SQL Server database, and then I need to put in the name. And then I'm going to choose the, sorry, that was a server name. So in this case, it's on my local machine, so I'm just going to put in localhost. And then for database name, here's the source that I'm going to use. And then I'll click Next. And the example that we're going to go through here is going to be to look at the custom voice trans, because that's probably an example of somewhere where people would want to go if they're doing Power Pivot, because it's going to have transaction information that's going to be of interest to them. So I'm going to go ahead and go into this view here where it's going to have the different tables that are in my source. And I'm going to choose the custom voice trans. And then I'm also going to choose, okay, so here's the custom voice trans table. And then I'm also going to choose a reference table. So in this case, I'm going to use the invent table, which is where you get the item detail within AX. And so now I need to find the right table. Okay, so now I've got my two tables. And then where I'm going to go from here is, so I'm going to bring in the data, and then I'm going to create a relationship there so Power Pivot understands how these are related together. And then from there, we'll build like a list-based report within Power Pivot, just to show you kind of one flavor, one way to look at it. So now those data sets have been brought into to Power Pivot, which is part of my Excel add-in here, or within the Excel environment. So what that means is that within the memory of Excel, there's 4,500 rows of custom voice trans records, and then 300 rows of invent table information. And you can, with how they've done the compression behind the scenes within the algorithms, it's actually possible to have millions of rows within Excel, and it is actually usable. So here now I've got my two tables. So I've got custom voice trans and invent table here, and I need to tell it how these two different fields are related, or these two different tables are related. So I'm going to choose the item ID and then do create relationship, and then this is my my fact or my transaction table, and then I'm going to look up the item to understand the name and posting groups out of the invent table itself. And you'll notice that because the name is the same, I went ahead and pre-populated this value here. So I'll go ahead and click Create, and you notice that I get an error message. And what my error is saying is that I have duplicate values in my inventory table, so my reference table. And so we'll go resolve that in just a moment. But the other thing I wanted to call out is that you notice that you can only create a join based on one particular field. So in this case, really what I want, if I have a multi-company situation in AX, is that I'd want to have a composite or a compound key where I join on multiple fields, but Power Pivot doesn't allow for that. So what I'm going to need to do is go to my table, my invent table, and filter that down to only a particular company. So I'm going to go to the invent table tab, and then I'll modify my query. So I'll go to the table properties, which is where it defines the data that it's bringing in. okay? And I'm going to scroll all the way to the end here, well, almost to the end at least. Okay, so I'm going to bring in just one particular company rather than the two. So I've selected only the CEU company, and then I'll click Save. Okay, and it's processing that, and the data has been updated. Okay, and now I'm going to go back to my other tab, the Custom Invoice Trans tab, and then I'm going to create that relationship now. So I'm going to click Create Relationship. It's pre-populated with the proper column, and then I'm going to go to that table, the invent table, and again, that column's there. So that's the proper relationship, and I'll click Create. And now what it's going to do is it's going to say that these two different tables are related to each other, and it's going to be based upon the item ID itself. Okay, so now it's I've got that connection, and so now I can go to Excel, and there's a neat pivot table option called Flattened Pivot Table, which I think is pretty nice for if you're going to do, like, say, a list-based report. So what I'm going to do is, you notice that I've got the two different fields or the two different tables that we brought in Power Pivot, and I'm going to bring on out of the invent table. So what I want is I want to get a transaction listing of the different items that have been sold. And I'm going to bring on the item group, maybe the item ID, the item name. So then that information is coming from the reference table. And I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of these subtotals because I really don't care to have them on the report. I just want to have a listing. So now here are the different fields I want from the invent table. And now I'll go back to the Custom Invoice Trans. And maybe I want to bring on, say, the invoice date. But I don't want it as columns. I want it to be on rows. Okay, so there's my invoice date. I'll bring on the invoice ID. So at this point now, what I've got is transaction level information. So for those of you that are familiar with cubes, and this is where Power Pivot can come in handy, if you wanted to write a report like this against a cube, it's oftentimes not possible because a cube really isn't intended to have invoice IDs, document numbers, and things like that. And so that's where our clients like to use this type of environment with the cube as a supplement, especially for financial analysts needing to do GL reconciliations and things like that, because they're able to see that transaction level information that's not typically available in the cube. But okay, so now I've got the quantity on here, and then I'll bring on the line amount as well. Okay, and so now just with probably 5 to 10 minutes of work, now I've got an example of a list-based report. I could even go out here and maybe I want to add a slicer to it. So I want to maybe add a particular time period to this. Maybe I want to filter down to only the items that were sold in a particular country as an example. So I'll bring on the country region code, and then that's going to be over here. Okay, so then by just choosing a different value, you'll notice that now that it's been filtered down to only Canada or whatever CA is. And if I go to US, now it's on the US. But so that slicer is automatically connected in that pivot table, and then I can see the transaction level information that's coming out of the lower level table. So that's a quick run through using a transaction source. As you noticed, we had the issue with trying to connect the two tables together. That was due to the fact that you can't do a compound key or joining on multiple columns within Power Query. And you could probably also see how that could cause issues if you're doing a report and you want multiple companies, either whether it's out of NAV or out of AX. So the alternative to that is to be able to construct an environment that's comprised of views, perhaps, or maybe also a proper data warehouse that would become the source for the Power Pivot environment. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Okay, and then I'll get back into Excel. And now what we'll do is we'll go through, try that one more time because the add-in for whatever reason didn't want to open up there. Okay, now I've got my add-in. So there's my Power Pivot add-in. I'll go to Manage. And so now what we'll do is we'll do an alternative using a data warehouse environment as the source. So the first steps are the same. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to pull in data from a SQL Server environment. I'm going to give it the name. And then I'm going to choose my source. So in this case, the database that's going to be my source is called PrecisionPoint PDQ data. Okay, and so I'm going to go ahead and import the table. And before I bring it in, I want to filter this down because there are a lot of transactions in the table. And so I want to filter it down to only customer transactions. So I'm going to choose only customers. And so the example that we're going to walk through here is putting together more of like a dashboard around sales information based on the data that's out here. So, okay, so now I've got my customer information. And then this is due to how the PrecisionPoint model is set up. But how our model works is that we bring in data from all over the business, so whether it's operating expenses, inventory, revenue, and so on. But for this purpose, because we only want to look at revenue, I'm going to apply a filter to only look at revenue accounts since we want, again, customer sales. So now I'm filtered down to only revenue, okay? And I'll click Finish. And so at this point, it's going to return the records that met that criteria. And it looks like there's 6,900 rows that met that criteria. Okay. And okay, so great. So now I've got the data in here. So just like we did before, I could go do a pivot table on top of it, just like you saw with the AX data source, but just to show you something a little bit different. I'll go back into Excel and go to the Insert tab, and then you'll notice that I've got PowerView, which is also an add-in that you'll need to bring into it. So I clicked on PowerView, and now it's going to open up a sheet. So it's not really a traditional Excel sheet. It's using, I believe, Silverlight technology, but it's a different sheet that will reside within your Excel workbook itself. So you'll notice that it recognized that there is a Power Pivot data model out there, and then it was called Financials because that's just the name that I gave it, and then these were the different sources that were out there. So how you can put together a PowerView dashboard is to take the different items that you see over here and then start to construct different objects that you want for reporting. So I'm going to start by bringing on the amount, and so we're going to do a sales dashboard. So of course you want to see your dollar amounts. So here's the dollar amounts, and then let's go ahead and add another dimension to that so it makes a little bit more sense. And we'll chart that rather than have it as a matrix or as a table. Okay, so now we've got the amount that we want, but let's see that trended over time. And in this case, we're going to look at the month number, which is the date or the number for the month within the year. So now you can see that we see the data over the course of the 12 months of time. So I've got that first part here. Maybe what I want to do is I want to add a slicer to this report. So I want to be able to filter down to particular item groups or item classes. So I'm going to bring on the item class. And I'm going to make this a slicer on the report. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the slicer button. Okay, so now that made it now PowerView knows that I wanted to use that as a slicer rather than to chart it or something else. And so if I choose car audio, for instance, you'll see that this table or the chart will automatically update. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the filter there. So now it's back to everything. And maybe now what would be nice is to see a different little view of sales, but now look at it by, say, the country. So I'm going to take country, bring it on over here. Okay, so now I've got my country information. And of course, I want to see a dollar amount with it, so I'll bring that down here. And okay, so now I see the dollar amount and country. Not really the format I want, so I'll just flip that around so I have country first. Okay, so now I see the country and the dollar amount associated with it. So starting to get a little bit more information to analyze. And then maybe another view would be to look at what types of customers that I'm selling to. So within this model, that would be what's called the posting group. Okay, so now I can see the posting group information, and then let's add on an amount to that as well, or I could have maybe used quantity if I want to see the units, and I can make that a pie chart. So now I've got a quick pie chart here with that information, and then I can see the different posting groups. So if I choose car audio, for instance, now I can see the specific groups that are associated with that. Another way to look at it might be that I choose only October here, and now you can see the sales that were specific to the month of October relative to the whole. So kind of a nice way to visualize that data. And whoops. Okay, so you can see those types of views, and then I could also add another slicer to the report. So maybe I want to see the time. So at this point, it's summing up all months, regardless of year. And to resolve that, let's bring on the calendar year here. So now that's on here, and because it's a numeric, it automatically summarized it. But instead, I wanted to not summarize it, and then just like we did with the item class, I'll make that a slicer on the report as well. And so now I can see I've got 2008, and now it's only for 2008. I could look at, say, 2009, and so on. So you can see how quickly you can put together a dashboard using PowerView, and you can also do some more fine-tuning of it. You can, of course, add a name to the report and various things. You can do more formatting and things of that nature to it. But so that's an example of where you can use the Power Pivot or the PowerView tool with the data warehouse. And so what you can see is that because of the data warehouse and everything that's behind the scenes, it's easy to start to build dashboards that have data from many different tables. So for instance, item class was from one reference table. Then you've got the customer grouping, which is from a different reference table, country information from a different area. And so had this been a multi-company environment, I could also filter this down to, or I could see a consolidated view. I could add a slicer for the company, so I could choose the different companies I want to look at. And then those are things that you can't do when you're going just straight against the transaction sources themselves. So that's, again, one example using Power Pivot or PowerView. Another way to look at this might be kind of a neat feature if you haven't seen this within PowerView is the ability to do some kind of impressive analysis around time movement. So I'm going to go ahead and do another PowerView report based on the data that's in the system, and I'm going to bring on the amount. I'll bring on the gross profit. Okay, and then I'll also bring on the item class so we can see the amount of gross profit detail around that. And then I'll change my chart type to a scatter. And so you'll see that we start to see the relationship between gross profit and dollars for item classes. And then if I wanted to, for instance, I can make the size of these items relative to quantity. And so I'll take quantity and bring that down here to size. And then, of course, once I add time to it, so if I want to look at the different quarters, I could do this by month as well if I wanted to. But I'll put that down here in what's called the play axis. And then what this allows us to see is over time how the different items relate to each other in the context of gross profit, amount, and quantity. So you can see the movement. So clearly the televisions had the greatest expansion into gross profit over the course of this time compared to the other items. So that's kind of a neat way to to visualize the data. And you can see within probably about 2 minutes or so how quickly it is to throw those types of things together with PowerView as well. So as far as kind of demonstration, that was the information that I plan to cover with the data warehouse environment. Okay. So with that, the intent was to keep this to be a reasonably short webinar. I was targeting about 45 minutes, and it looks like I'll be pretty close to that here. So just to let you know of some additional resources that might be helpful for you. One is around that compatibility issue. That's I'm not sure how how clearly I described that, but it's important for you to understand that that's an area where there's some thought that needs to go into it. And so this is an example of a source that you might want to take a look at to understand the different versions of Power Pivot and how they can affect how you'd roll it out within a company. And then also, if you want just a good old-fashioned summary of Power BI within from Microsoft's perspective, here's a good link. So the Power BI side, if you just do a Bing search or your search tool of desire, you'll be able to find information from Microsoft on Power BI pretty easily, and then they'll walk through it. So my goal here today was really to describe some of the more practical aspects of it so you're aware of those. If you do have questions, you're welcome to reach out to me. And again, the name is Noah Kluge. You can see my email address on the screen here, and I am in the U.S., so it's the phone number is 316-448-1033. If you want just general information about PrecisionPoint, you're welcome to go out to precision-point.com to look at information that we have on our website. So that's the information that I plan to cover today, and let me look at the questions and see if there's anything that's out there. Okay, I think Okay, there's a question about using the PowerView app for Windows 8. My understanding from the research that I've done into that is that it does not work with the RT version. So that's what I have found. I would definitely recommend that you go out and do a little bit more research into that yourself. But my understanding is that the RT app will not support the PowerView app that would work with other Windows 8 devices. And then okay, it doesn't look like anybody brought anything in through chat. So what I'm going to do is, just to give you a little bit of warning here, I'm going to go ahead and unmute everyone, which can always be just a little bit dangerous. So I'll go ahead and unmute everyone, and then if you have a question, you're welcome to ask. Okay, well, okay, great. So, okay, I'd like to ask if anybody out there has any questions. I can see that I'm getting a little bit of feedback out there. And nobody's jumping in to ask questions, so that's perfectly fine. I appreciate that. So with that, I'll go ahead and mute everyone again and say thank you very much for your time today. And again, if you do have any further questions for me, you're welcome to reach out to me or anyone else at PrecisionPoint. So with that, thank you again.